Hi there, my name is Andy Farquharson and I'm your host on Alternative Exit,
the podcast dedicated to educating small business owners about the possibilities, benefits and challenges of transitioning to an employee ownership model. Did you know that there are over 200 million SMEs around the globe with an owner that will be retiring within the next 10 years? Many of these owners will never actually find a buyer for their business, forcing them to close their doors, wreaking havoc on their employees and the communities. There is an alternative. This show will explore different forms of employee ownership and the best practices for a successful transition. Each episode is going to feature interviews with experts on employee ownership, business owners who've successfully made the transition, and consultants who've helped facilitate these changes.
Okay, now let's get on with the show.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Alternative Exit. Today we've got a great guest who's got some fantastic experience sitting on both sides of the fence, both as an owner who's made the transition to EOTs over there in the UK, but also as sort of one of the leading providers, in terms of an employee ownership trust advisory service with his company called GoEO. So back in 2021, Chris Maslin, our guest today, transitioned his own firm, Maslin, to an EOT to secure its future and reward his team. But now he's on a mission to simplify EOT transitions for other small businesses. So wanting to make employee ownership clear, affordable and accessible. So Chris, welcome to the Alternative Exit.
Thanks for having me, Andy. Yeah, you've introduced me quite well there.
Well, I'm glad. Sometimes I do stuff that up and do get corrections, but I'm glad we got it right this time. So Chris, I'd love to understand a little bit more about you. What made you think about an EOT for your own business?
So a combination of things. So it was before COVID, that's now become the new sort of before Christ, I think, in terms of where people think it was. Yeah. If I'm honest, I was just getting a bit bored. So one of the things that would scare me was when some of the senior team were super excited about the future growth of the business. And I was not so excited. I'd enjoyed getting it to where it was, but I was at the stage where growing from here, yes, it maybe means more money from me, all being well, but it also means more stress. And you know what? I'm at a stage where the trade-off, that doesn't appeal anymore. But obviously it was brilliant having staff that was super keen to keep pushing things, but it didn't feel right. That, I feel like you need to have a leader of a business who is the most driven, the most inspirational, the one that's really passionate about pushing it forwards. If that's not the case, they shouldn't be the leader anymore. So, I think with employee ownership, one thing that the Employee Ownership Association in the UK will be quite sort of keen to point out is that change of ownership and change of leadership are not necessarily the same things. They don't necessarily have to come together. But really, I was looking to do both. I felt like I didn't want it to be my company anymore, mainly for selfish reasons. I didn't want all that stress and responsibility to be on my shoulders. Very happy to share the rewards that came with it more evenly with the team. And employee ownership seemed a really nice way to sort of tick a bunch of those boxes.
Okay, really good. And how did you become aware of it? Was it something that you just sort of went and dug up on your own, or did you come across some other advisors? Or
I honestly can't remember when I first heard about it. I suppose anyone who's been in business for a while, you will periodically get letters and emails from people saying, we can sell your business for 100 million quid. It'll be amazing. So I suppose, you've always got in the back of your mind an exit at some point. I can't remember how I first heard about EOTs, the Employee Ownership Trust, which is the model that we went for. But probably the first person who helped me learn a lot about it was Chris Budd, who I think you may have spoken to before on this. So he has an organization, the Eternal Business. He did it for his own company. He's got a slightly different background to me. He's focusing on slightly different things, but he's also helping businesses with the transition from, founder ownership. So yes, he certainly filled in a lot of the gaps in my knowledge, but I can't remember where I first heard the concept.
Okay. Yeah. It's funny. A lot of people, especially when they're joining sort of the movement back when you did before COVID, people struggle to sort of figure out the origination of where employee ownership came from for them. So one thing, when you were talking about that change for you, where you were losing a little bit of that sort of desire and that to drive to grow your business, but you talked about sort of needing to make that transition both in ownership and leadership. How did you think about, I'd love it if you, in ownership, you obviously had the employee ownership trust, the EOT. How did you think about that transition of leadership?
So the blunt answer would be, I think we did a fairly bad job of it. Whereas, one of the things that I've been learning a lot more about since is about the importance of roles and accountabilities and responsibilities. And I think that we very much paid lip service to that. And I imagine a lot of founders will perhaps have a similar mindset to mine, because, if you set up a business, you're used to the fact that when something needs doing, you need to do it. And if you don't know how to do it, you need to figure out how to do it. There isn't really a sort of step-by-step guide to follow in terms of how to be a business. Whereas when you're an employee, more often than not, there's, right, here's your job. This is what you do. This is how you do it. If you get a problem, you ask your line manager, they'll help you with that. So I guess I went into it very much with that mindset of, well, we'll just figure it out as we go. And, I don't need to map everything out in any great detail. And I think this was not helpful for the senior team, because one question I can remember them asking me at least twice, Chris, what is your role going to be after the sale? And I would say, in a way that I thought was extremely helpful, since no, it wasn't, well, don't worry, you just do what you want to do and I'll do whatever needs doing around that. Because in reality, that's sort of what I've been doing for, the 5 years leading up to it anyway. But I think this was really unhelpful for them, because they were left sort of thinking, right, so you're kind of telling us we're in charge and we can take a lead, but you're also telling us, or indirectly telling us, you're going to be sticking your nose into everything and periodically, challenging stuff. So I think with hindsight, what I should have done was been a lot more clear. And I probably needed to figure this out myself first. What were the things I didn't want to do? And I maybe was fairly clear on that. I mean, the primary thing was, to be blunt, I was a bit fed up with dealing with customers, can get a bit Groundhog Day, answer the same questions. So I was quite clear about that. But in terms of, I suppose bigger picture, so things like who's in charge of the marketing function for the business generally, who's really the ultimate decision maker. We also sort of related but slightly different, had this idea that there were going to be 3 people in this leadership team, none of whom really had more power than the others. They kind of make decisions together. And again, I think in theory, that sounded lovely. In practice, I don't think it really made sense, because, they do have slightly different skill sets, but you might have the person that, for argument's sake, was the best with numbers saying, I think we need to do this on the finances side. And the other 2 might disagree, but the reality is they're not as well informed. So what do you do there? So, how the business now operates, there is quite clearly an MD. They ultimately have final decision on everything. That's not me, for the avoidance of doubt. They have other people, including me as one of these, who will give them input sometimes, and they sometimes delegate tasks and say, look, I want to do this thing. Can you go off and research it and let me know what you think? But I think that's a lot healthier. So it maybe contradicts in some ways employee ownership, where part of it can be about, we're all in this together. We're trying to reduce the hierarchy, but I actually think human beings really need hierarchy. People, they understand it, and a lot of people don't want to be responsible for making decisions.
Yeah, I think that aligns with a lot of the other employee-owned businesses that we speak to. The reality is that people still do need that structure. Like the ownership is not management, and management can take lots of different forms of structure, but there does need to be something there. People need to know what to do, and need to be, and whether they're a part of defining that or not. I think that sort of comes down to that management approach. I mean, you talked there about that senior leadership engagement, about sort of how you're going to sort of define that MD role, and you figured out there at the time. How did you go about? What are some of the other ways that you engaged the other parts of the team with their new ownership?
We've tried a few things. I don't think we have a problem there, but I do think that, maybe some of the cheerleaders of EO will say, oh, it's amazing. Once you've got employee owned, everyone will be transformed in how they'll do their role. They'll be so much more enthusiastic, this, that, and the other. I think the reality can be not quite as significant as that. So I don't in any way want to suggest we have a bad team, but I suppose what I've come to realize a bit more, and again, the Employee Ownership Association will talk about this. They'll talk about how, in your team, you will have 30% of people who will love it. They'll love the concept. They want to throw themselves into everything. You'll have 30% of people that, with the right prodding, will be able to do stuff. And you'll have 40% of people that will still be of the view, it's a job. I come in, I do as I'm told, I get paid, I don't want to get fired. And they may well do a good job. It's not about them being bad employees, but it is just a job for them. So, and I think it's healthy to accept that, because if you try and fight that, you fight an uphill battle, just getting really frustrated with people who are doing a decent job. You know, they're good employees. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but you're getting angry at them for not behaving like you think they should. So we did a few things like, an employee engagement survey. Obviously, we have regular chats with the team. I mean, not so much me now. It was more me a few years ago, but just, check-ins with people. Sort of, you have the formal appraisal thing probably twice a year, but maybe once a fortnight, a little chat, just a one-to-one over a coffee. How are you feeling? Anything's getting you down at the moment?
So yeah, it was more like that engagement in the surveys. Like, how are they engaged in the trusts? Do they, like you talked about that split 30, 30, 40, right? Is there a 30% who are raising their hands? Are you democratically electing people who are going to be represent the trust? Like, what does that look like in Maslin?
So, there is an employee trustee. So there's 3 people on the trustee board, one of which is, a sort of rank and file employee. I'm one of the other trustees, sort of in that exiting founder role, where I suppose I've got that long-term experience, and I hope I have a strong affinity with the business, but I'm increasingly removed from the day-to-day. And then we have an independent trustee who's just there for a bit of external viewpoint, can't see the wood from the trees kind of thing. So the staff have that person. I mean, they do a useful role. There's a bit of me that would like the staff to use them a bit more, in terms of, maybe asking some challenging questions that might make us feel a bit uncomfortable, but let us know that the staff really care and they're worrying about these things. I mean, some of the cynics about employee ownership will say that, if you ask the employees how would they improve the business, they'll for a couple of hours, and they'll come back and say, we want a pay rise, more holiday, and can we have better biscuits? And there is some truth to that for a lot of people, because I think they're still in that employee mindset. When you think of improving the business, they mean, how can I get more out of this? How can I make this better for me? Rather than thinking, how can we sell more? How can we increase our profits? How can we streamline things? It's difficult to get people to start to think that way. And I wouldn't say we've achieved that. We've tried. We've done a few brainstorming sessions. We make, some little inroads.
Do you think that that's an education challenge? Like that they just need to be better educated about that? Or do you think that might be a little bit aligned to, say, some of the structural setup of the EOT, where people don't actually own equity, like they just own or share to a right to the profits?
It's a good question. I mean, I think part of it is the knowledge side, or, even with that, I would imagine that most of them, they kind of know it, but don't necessarily put it in place. I mean, it's like, we all know we should eat more vegetables and exercise more. Whether we do it is another matter. And I guess it all feels quite abstract. It's a bit different from a commission, where if you're a salesperson, if I get that sale at this amount, I will get this much in my bank account. It's a lot more wishy-washy. If we all do a good job and the business profits go up, I should hopefully get a bigger profit share. And it's also very dependent on other people. It's dependent on a load of things that are outside your control. So I think because of that, it's maybe harder for people to really embrace it. I mean, when you talk about the EOT model versus direct ownership, so we currently have what's called a hybrid model. So to get most of the perks of an EOT, when I say perks, tax perks, for the staff and for myself, the EOT has to have a controlling stake. So it needs to own more than 50%, which it does. But in our business, we currently have 40%, which is owned by individuals. Some of that is still myself and my wife. Some of that is the MD of the business, who didn't own any shares 3 years ago, but does now. And bit by bit, my wife and I are sort of transitioning our shares to other people. So I guess kind of tying in with that 30-30-40 thing, I think that every business will always have some people that are prepared to go above and beyond. They'll do whatever needs doing. If that includes sometimes working evenings and weekends, so be it. And I think it helps that those people do have a direct stake. So yes, it does a little bit of, it's sort of, I'm quite aware that you've got, capitalism at the one end, which is, well, I'm the owner, you're just the plebby worker, so you do as you're told and I'll fire you when I feel like it and I'll make loads of money. You've got the full employee ownership at the other end, which is, we're all humans, we're all equal, we all work hard, we should all share the same. And I think everyone sits somewhere along that line of what's healthy. And probably if you'd have asked me 3 or 4 years ago, I would have said, I think we want to drift towards 100% EOT ownership. I think that's the goal. We just might get there in steps. But I think the me of now thinks, no, we'll have the EOT, which is for all employees, whether they're with us for a year or 10 years. And then we'll have the direct ownership stake, which will, each one of those has to think about their own succession. If they want to come to move on, they've got to find another up and coming employee that's prepared to buy them out. But I think that that's really good for the long-term future of the business. And by long-term, I mean, potentially centuries, but we're talking decades here, because these are people that they're going to buy in. It's going to be awkward for them to sell. So they're going to need to be there for many, many years for that to be worthwhile.
And this is also a norm within the industry. I mean, Maslin's was an accounting firm, wasn't it? It still is. So yeah, it's the norm for that partner style model for people to be able to buy in.
That's a very good point. I mean, I'm aware of that, but I've not considered that to some extent legally it's very different, but actually it's kind of the same in that staff will come, they'll get promoted and they'll go. Partners will also come, but there's that element of buying in. You can have these extra rewards, but you've got to put your money where your mouth is and take the extra stress. So I suppose, effectively we're recreating that partnership model, albeit I wouldn't call it that because they're not partners, et cetera, but it's very similar.
Okay. And so are they on the cap table, or are you managing this via, say, like an enterprise management incentives or something like that?
So as an accountancy firm, we don't qualify for EMI. There's a few sort of restricted trades, and we're one of them. So at the moment, I'd like to claim this was some master plan thought out well in advance. Very few things are. It's a case of you make a decision that seems the best decision at the time, and then you're left with the consequences of that, and you try and evolve from that. So when we did the EOT sale, my wife and I initially retained 40% for ourselves. Whether or not that was a good idea is another matter. At the time, it seemed sensible. We had a young team. I felt like I needed to keep a decent stake, partly to keep me interested, but also to give them the confidence that I was still interested, that I wasn't just going to walk off. But one of the perks of that is it's then given me the ability to, bit by bit, transfer some of those shares to some of the people I think are worthy. So charging them money for those, they're putting their money in their pocket for them.
I was going to ask that. Like you said, transferring. Are you selling? And were you selling at the same valuation that you provided to the EOT?
No. So I mean, this is one of the things I've not enjoyed. Very much first world problem. A lot of these problems will be first world problems. I'm selling to people who have less money than me. It's not quite as dark as this, but it's almost, well, how much money have you got in your bank account? All right, well, I'll take that and I'll give you this in return. But I think it is not, and I say this genuinely, it's not about making money for me, but I do think it's very important that they risk some of their own money so that they know they've got something to lose. Because that's, the negative side on it, which is positive for the business, but negative for that individual. I think there's an element of it being a poison chalice. You now own a direct stake in this business. You've paid money for that. If this business goes down the hill, you lose all that money you put in. So you know what? The business will have dark times again, I'm sure. And that's when owning a business isn't quite as wonderful.
And it's very much, it's the carrot or the stick. And that's where you see those, like entrepreneurs. They've obviously, they're like you went and set up Maslin's, like with obviously a positive outlook that, hey, we're going to be able to start this and turn it into something potentially bigger. But when you've got some real risk on the line, it does create that strong stick. But I think when people like 100% EOT, they're all about the carrot. They're all about, hey, look, we want to perform. So A, we've got a job tomorrow, and B, we've got potential profit share tomorrow. And I don't know which one's the biggest driver.
So I think sitting alongside that, and it was something that I didn't consider before doing the EOT sale, but maybe about a year afterwards, I was starting to think about this, was that for this purpose, let's imagine the business is 100% EOT owned, right? Those staff have nothing more to lose than their job if it goes horribly wrong, which, that's a good thing, right? Yes, you could lose your job, but you can't lose your home, the 50 grand you put in, whatever it may be. But a downside of that, I feel, is it's a little bit like, what perhaps led to the financial crisis however many years ago. You've got these people where if they gamble big and they win, they're a hero and they get tons of money. If they gamble big and they lose, they lose their job, they go and get another job at the next firm, rinse and repeat. So it did make me a bit nervous that actually I had a lot to lose if that business collapsed. But our senior team, they'd say, oh, sorry, Chris, I've destroyed the business. Whoops. Anyway, see you later. Off I go. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted someone to have a direct stake, just to encourage them, to do really well financially if it succeeds, but to maybe make them a bit more cautious, a bit more, I have got something to lose if I make a horrendous mistake. So maybe just to not be particularly gung-ho, I guess.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, no, I think it's fair. I mean, that's obviously how, that's the businesses I've been a part of all my life. It is very much that, hey, look, the people who take the risk are the ones who potentially get the greater outsized reward, but also the ones who are turning the lights on, who are willing to sort of take those sacrifices. I think where I sort of see is that, I'd love to believe that there is that not so much a utopia, but there is that place in an employee ownership model where everyone collectively is going to be able to go through and do what's required in those hard times, because collectively they want the business to continue to be there. And there are some great examples of that, but it's not going to happen in a vacuum. Right? It's got to happen when you go all the way back to those sort of pieces that you talked about between management and leadership and ownership, like that. All those pieces need to be put into place.
And I think a lot of that will work down to, the humanity of it. So, certainly I've experienced the positive side of this, 10 years ago, where for whatever reason, the business is going through a really rough time and I'm going through a really rough time. And some of those staff really cared about me and they would see that and they would think, right, I need to do whatever I can do to try and make this better for the business and for Chris. And I think, that's human nature. Well, assuming you like whoever you're working for. And I think that still continues now. So, it's not just a case of only those people who own shares care, but I suppose they're the ones that have a lot to lose. And by virtue of that, assuming they're nice to the other staff will care too, because, you don't want to see these people crumple in front of your eyes. So I can see there being a benefit in everyone having a direct financial stake. There's an element that comes with admin complexities. When people join the business, leave the business, how do you deal with that? So, there's a question mark on how worthwhile that is for everybody, because sometimes it can be more trouble than it's worth. But I think, you can still have that feeling of employee ownership, and the EOT still gives them a lot of the benefits. But I think, sorry, I'm waffling a bit, but I know one of the things where, it's perhaps the shortcoming of the EOT is that you can devote your life to a business for 40 years and, enjoy your salary and some profits whilst you're there. But then when you leave with nothing. So the closest way we deal with that is, we pay a lot more than the basic minimum into pension schemes. So they still, they don't take any part of the business with them, but at least we feel like we're sort of making sure that it's not a case of the second you leave this business, you're going to live in poverty for the rest of your life.
Yeah, well, we both share that concern about the EOT, and I do love the models that actually do give people that, that long-term sort of bit of equity in the business, whether that's sort of held within their retirement plans like ESOPs or the more direct share models. But I just want to switch gears a little bit. Like you're doing a little advisory work with the Go EO. What are the most common questions that you get from owners who are looking to transition to employee ownership?
Loads of different ones. Well, one of them, hold on, how come you charge less than 10 grand for this and that other firm charges 100 grand for what superficially seems the same thing? To which the blunt answer is, we are kind of offering I call it a bare bones service, but we're dealing with the legals and the financial side of things efficiently. And so, as you'll be very familiar with, there's also the human side of it. There's the change of leadership side of it. So there's lots of other things that a business might need support with. Really, we're just doing part of it. But maybe that wasn't the kind of question you were thinking of. I suppose other questions we get asked a lot. One of the most depressing things from my side will be, well, you said you think my business is worth £1 million. Well, this other guy said it's worth 5 million quid. So I think it's worth 5 million quid. To which we have to pretty much say, well, it's just not going to stack up for the employees if you try and sell for 5 million quid.
Well, I think that sort of goes back to that point you were talking about right at the start. Like a lot of business owners are getting these cold outreaches saying, hey, I'm going to pay your business X. And they also sort of read a lot of the news. Hey, look, this company just got sort of funded at this valuation. But none of that actually applies to, or very, very rarely applies to SMEs, those kinds of valuations. So yeah, it's got to be tough having a conversation with someone to try to realign their expectations about what's going to be real.
Yes. I mean, I think it feels like, everyone who's got kids, they think that their kid's special. Everyone that's got a business thinks that their business is special. And you need to be very, very careful if you try and point out that actually their child or their business is quite average. You've seen better ones before and so on and so forth, because it's quite an emotional, personal subject. So yeah, that is one where you've got expectations that are just out of kilter with reality. And I think, increasingly I drift towards, it's not my place to try and realign. So I'll just say, look, this is what we think your business is worth. This is why. This is how we think it could work. If you think it's worth vastly more, best of luck. But, we can't help you with that.
So are you doing valuations as well as part of your service, or are you just sort of structuring the finance for them?
Yeah, so we'll do the valuation as well. So, I mean, okay. My background's in accountancy and tax. So I suppose, I sort of cover the financial and the tax side of things. We then work with a lawyer who does more of the, the nuts and bolts of the shared purchase agreement and the trust deed and all that kind of stuff. I mean, we get a wide variety of questions from founders thinking about doing it. A lot of them are, I think if you're looking at employee ownership, more often than not, you're doing it for what I would call the right reasons, by which I generally mean that you're appreciative of the staff that have helped you get the business to the stage it's at. Yes, you don't want to give the business away. One or two of our clients have, but generally they're selling, and they're selling for a decent sum. But, they probably could get more on the open market, but they know that, what, if I sell for a little bit less than I might have been able to get, it's the staff that are benefiting. If they get a bargain and I'm happy with the staff getting a bargain, that sits well with me.
How do they think about, I guess, sort of another one of the differences you talked about, sort of a third-party sale, like they'll potentially get a higher valuation. The other part that you hear a lot that's different is obviously the terms of the deal, like taking a lot longer to actually get all that money out. I mean, how do owners react when they start hearing that it could be a bit of a delay for them to get that to get that whole valuation into their bank account?
Yeah, probably by the time they speak to us, most of them are already aware of that, so it doesn't come as a huge surprise. I mean, we do stress to people that that's a risk of the EOT model, in that, if you sell to an EOT, you sign on the dotted line and the business collapses 6 months later, well, be warned, it doesn't really matter what sell price you've notionally agreed. If the business doesn't continue for long enough and make enough money to pay it out, you're not going to get paid it. But there are also so many perks of an EOT sale compared to a trade sale. So, you as the vendor can basically control the whole process. You don't really have any risk of the buyer dragging you along and then pulling out at the last minute. You very rarely get any haggling. Often with a trade sale, you get the initial offer that's here, and then they ask for a bunch of info, and then they drop it down to here. And then just before sale date, they're cheeky and drop it down a bit more, knowing that you've kind of emotionally committed to it. And also, with trade sales, very rarely will you get 100% on day one. You may well get a decent chunk on day one, but often the rest of it will be based on performance over the next 2 years, say, and the buyer will be in control of the performance. So, we hear a lot of situations where I say, look, Andy, I'll buy your business. I'll give you 50% up front and 25% each over the next 2 years, but that'll be based on assuming the business meets at least this profit level. But then what I'll do is I'll come in and say, well, I think we need a better accounting function, and I've got another organization that does that. So I'll get a management recharge that comes in for all this brilliant extra work we're doing here and a marketing team. So I can basically manipulate the profit to whatever figure I want and then say, sorry, Andy, didn't meet the profit level, so you're not going to get the rest of your payments. And, it's maybe a bit frowned upon, but legally the buyer will have made sure the contracts are watertight and there's not a lot you can do about it. So with EOT, yes, that headline figure that you hear may be a bit lower, but there's very little scope for the business to wriggle out a bit, assuming the business carries on doing profitably. If the business goes bust, you won't get paid, but it's unlikely that a business will think, we'll make ourselves go bust just so we can wriggle out of paying this. And plus there's the tax perks. So generally speaking, it should be a tax-free sale, whereas a trade sale won't be. So that, again, can help soften the fact that you might have a slightly lower headline figure.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's just a massive benefit. And I think that's also, it could create some bad actors coming in who are just sort of looking to also maximize their returns. I mean, have you experienced any of those coming across your door?
When you say bad actors, I mean, we certainly have the ones that say, I think my business is worth this and I'm not going to sell for a penny less than that. And assuming I end up saying, well, I don't think it's worth that. So good luck, but we're not going to help you sell for that figure you want to sell for. And I mean, I suppose one of the ways the law's changed recently is for the founder to retain those tax perks, the organization needs to not only meet some of the criteria for the 12 months before and at the point of sale, but it now needs to be for basically 4 to 5 years afterwards. It used to be 1 to 2. So, 1 to 2 years, you just about think, well, I can kind of rig things and prop it up just enough to tick that box and then fine, what happens after that, I don't care. But 4 to 5 years, it makes it a lot more awkward. And I think actually one of the reasons why that law changes, I believe, we never had anything to do with this, but I believe there were situations where I want to sell my business to a third party, whoever they may be, is prepared to offer me whatever the money is. But we basically agree that they'll buy the business in 2 years' time. I'll insert a middleman, which will be this EOT. That's really only ever a transition vehicle. I never intended the EOT to be long-term, but it's just a way of getting a tax break in the middle. So I think by greatly extending that period, it just means, in theory, you could still do that, but it's just much less appealing because you'd have to do it over a much longer time.
Yeah, and it's tougher to get that guaranteed buyer for that in that instance as well.
A lot can change in 5 years. I mean, a lot can change in 1 to 2 years, but you feel perhaps it's more of a realistic punt to take.
Okay. Do you find with that deferred payment, do you find that people, there's a lot of changes? AI is obviously coming in and disrupting a lot of industries. I mean, do you find, are any of these owners coming in and going, well, I don't know what my business is going to look like in 3 years' time with the advent of AI?
I would guess that quite a few of them will be thinking that, and that may be partly why they want to sell up. From the point of view of, AI probably won't kill my business in the next 6 months, but it might kill it in the next 6 years. So selfishly, you know what? I'd kind of rather cash my chips in now. I don't know. I think there will be some people that have that thought, but I suppose maybe, and perhaps it's an age thing that, you get to the stage that if you're in your 50s or your 60s, you felt like, look, I dealt with the incoming of computing and the internet, but this AI thing, I'll let the next generation, that'd be their problem to figure out how to evolve the business around that.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you, when companies are coming to you or any other advisor, what are the things that they need to be ready or they need to have prepared to be ready for employee ownership?
So I think that psychologically, they need to be at peace with the fact that it won't be their company anymore. That does hit people in different ways. In terms of their role, it's hugely varied. So there is nothing wrong with you selling to an EOT and continuing to be full-time managing director for the next 5 years, 10 years, whatever. Equally, you can sell to an EOT and disappear off into the sunset. You could even disappear off into the sunset before selling to the EOT. But I do think, most commonly founders will want to phase down gradually, partly because they may be nervous about how ready the team are to really, if they did just disappear. So I think one of the things that people don't always think about, but they should, is what they're going to do with their extra free time. Because I think, if you've been stressed because you've been running a business for decades, the idea of having all the free time in the world just appeals massively. And the thought of, well, what will I do with it? I'll worry about that later. But I think, you do hear the situations of the people that they sell their business, they get a wad of cash, they go and sit on a beach. That's wonderful for a week. They went and travel the world. Okay, that's fun for a month. Then what? And they've lost their sense of purpose. So, they used to be a really important person. Now they're just some old, fairly wealthy, but not that important person. So I think having a real think about that, what are you going to do with your time? And also touching on what I talked about earlier, where you are still going to be involved in the business, what will your role be in the business? Try and be quite specific about that. So think about those. I mean, think about the finances. Again, maybe this wasn't as much a thing for me because I did the sale. I was in my very late 30s, so I was not thinking this is a retirement thing. It's the end of this chapter of my life, but it's not the end of my working life. I think for a lot of people, if they're doing it perhaps in their 50s, 60s or 70s, they need to be confident that the money that they'll get from this, especially if they might not get all of it, will that see them comfortably through retirement? So that's kind of your IFA, financial advisor territory, because you can't go back. So, I think it's a problem a lot of people have when they're thinking about retirement. They maybe think they've got enough, but they know that if they retire and then 5 years later they run out of money, it's quite hard to then get back into working again.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a tough thing. Definitely one of those sort of things advisable for people to be able to get that really picture correct. Chris, this has been great. As I said, you provided such a different perspective, like to be able to, as I said, do it on both sides of the fence. Of someone who has made the transition and now helps others. But before we finish up, I'd like to ask you sort of 3 questions and you offer a quick response in a fast round. How does that sound?
Oh, that's polite way of saying I've waffled far too long. I'll keep
hey, everyone gets the same preamble, so it's all good. But who is the leader that you most admire in employee ownership?
Campbell McDonald.
Campbell McDonald. Okay.
I don't know if you know the name. He's almost the opposite to me in terms of he's very interested in the big picture, like the macroeconomic side. If 10,000 businesses did this, how would the UK be different? Whereas I'm, like I say, I'm at the other extreme. So I'm like, right, you're a business owner with 10 staff. How are we going to help this for you and your little situation? So he's a real big thinker. I like to think that I'm also a big thinker, but in a very, very different way. And so, I'm making lots and lots of small differences, which, significant for the 10 people in that business, but utterly insignificant in the wider picture, whereas he's working much more in the big picture.
Okay. So we've got Campbell. What is your favorite resource on employee ownership?
Obvious answer, I suppose, the Employee Ownership Association.
EOA?
Yeah, the EOA in the UK. So they're a not-for-profit. They provide lots of networking opportunities. They provide some courses. Their flagship event, which is in November each year, big conference. They'll have about 1,000 people going there. We'll have a trade stand there, but there'll be lots of talks, lots of useful stuff. They're a great source of information.
Very cool. And what would you say to a business owner who's sitting on the fence regarding a transition to employee ownership?
I would say if you want the most lucrative financial option for you, don't go for it. Not because it can't work well financially, but I think if that's your primary goal, I think there's real risk it won't work for a bunch of different reasons. So I think you need to care about the long-term future of the business, not because of your own, you can make decent money from an EOT sale. You need to care about the staff, and you need to love the idea that in 10 years' time, the staff are making loads of money out of that business and you're not.
Yeah.
If that idea really appeals to you, great, go for the EOT. If you're thinking more short-term, how do I get the most money out of this? Nah, probably not for you.
It's going to be a tough transition for a lot of people, especially if the business grows a lot. But hey, Chris, thank you so much for your time and for sharing a lot of your wisdom today. I mean, where can people go if they want to learn more about you and Go EO?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn, Chris Maslin. It's not a very common surname, so there aren't very many of us there. You should find me quite easily, or goeo.uk. So that's the business. Its primary goal is for the slightly smaller companies, so probably at least about 5 staff, maybe up to about 50 at the top end, just trying to make it easy and affordable for you to do the transition.
Okay, awesome. I'll put some links in the show notes for people as well. Chris, thank you very much for joining us on The Alternative Exit.
Thanks so much, Andy.
Cheers.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to continue learning about employee ownership as an alternative exit, head across to abettermonday.me for additional links and resources. You can also make sure to subscribe or follow along in your favorite podcast app, and be sure to leave us a 5-star review.